The lamps in the parlour breathed a syrupy light, patient and even, while the shutters kept the Arkansas night like a careful secret. The crickets did their work beyond the veranda, filing the darkness with a steady blade of sound, and the hallway clock divided the air into small, obedient squares. On the work table, silk the colour of cream lay unfurled, its sheen broken only by a blue porcelain dish where needles slept like quiet minnows. Ruth stood with her palm cooling the fabric, listening for the bell's last tremor from the yard, that brass tongue that told the house when to wake and when to keep still. The evening smelled of starch and river. Duty hummed, conscience shifted. What is a boundary when law writes one name in ink and another in chalk, and both must read the same page as fate? What is justice when the only courtroom is a parlour where sighs are minutes and compliments are verdicts, and no witness is invited to speak? Ruth's breath moved in the small space between thread and cloth, the way a violinist leans into silence before the bow begins. She lifted a needle, felt its cool length rest against her finger, then set it down again as if replacing a word she could not say. The gown waited on its stand, all promise and posture, meant for a charity supper that would draw town notables, a visiting minister and the new teacher from over the river. It would glide, and others would glide with it, or so the house believed. The hem knew otherwise. The room's single window gave onto the lane of pecans that ran to the gate, and past that gate lay a town the ledgers called simply obligations, a congregation that believed propriety was a sacrament. Somewhere along that road, a clerk in Pulaski County copied numbers from one column to another, making the 1854 account faithful and final, and the script had loops like smiles. In the big book by the pantry, Ruth's name lived in a strict hand. First name only, hours, tasks, rations, the arithmetic of silence. Above that book a swatch of mourning ribbon pinned to a nail caught a thin draught, and trembled the way a sparrow trembles when holding its place on a wire. Records held still, people did not. Stillness could be an argument. Ruth tested the fabric with the back of her fingers and felt its answering chill, that ceremonial cold that fine silk keeps for rooms like this. She noted a loose hook at the waist, and a bead that had drifted a little, a flaw almost beautiful in its error, like a tide line left after a storm that only the shoreline remembers. She reached for the needle again, and looked at its eye until it forgot to be a tool and became a thought. The bell in the yard gave one last small sound as the air cooled, not a ring so much as a closing breath, and the echo made a round space in the room that a choice could occupy. The walls listened. The gown listened. She straightened the measuring tape and set it like a ribbon across the skirt, a pale horizon where steps would one day fall. Out in the dark, a wagon wheel whispered across ruts toward the river road and then was gone, the way news is gone once the parlour has decided what the town should hear. In the sideboard drawer, the guest book waited for signatures that would praise the evening and its taste, names that would sparkle for a week and then settle in the dust. Ruth laid her hand where a train would brush the floorboards and saw in a flash one indelible image, a hem that taught attention, a line so quiet it changed how a body met the room. The needle lay beside her like a small, bright sentence. She left it bright. When the lamps were turned down, the gown kept its posture and the house kept its law, and the ledger in the pantry closed with a sound that imitated sleep. Ruth stood a moment longer, letting the room describe itself to her, until its boasts felt temporary and its corners felt human. She breathed once, deeply, as if pulling a future into the chamber of now, and pressed her palm to the silk in farewell for the night. Then she folded the muslin cover over the dress and tied its tape with a knot that was neither haste nor fear, but a promise to her own name. The parlour had written its verdict in light, the hem had begun composing an appeal. Some answers must be given quietly. Morning arranged itself the way this house preferred. Coffee drifting from the kitchen like a treaty, the corridor rugs smoothed by an early hand, and the front steps rinsed with a bucket that left a wet alphabet to evaporate in the sun. From the river road came a faint clatter where wagons turned toward the cotton gin, and farther still, the Arkansas River made its slow, coarse-sober remarks. The plantation presented itself as a small republic. Big house at the crest with its white columns like opinions, quarters aligned in obedient rows, smokehouse, dairy, loom shed, and a yard where the bell hung from a timber. Inside, the mistress, Eleanor Fairchild, conducted her calendar like a choirmaster conducts rests. Tuesdays for sewing review, Thursdays for callers, Saturdays for pantry reckoning, Sundays for display. Her husband was more ledger than man, happiest when the cotton counts and notes due rested in neat accords. Even his boots seemed to prefer arithmetry. Their creases were measured and fair. A new minister from up the river was expected to bless the charity supper, and this prospect sharpened the household tone. Chairs were moved a half-inch and moved back again. Silver was checked for its good memory. Curtains were trained to hold a better fold. Order loves to rehearse. The sewing room answered the bell's first command. Light entered aslant, struck the blue dish where needles lay like tiny hyphens between one life and another, and travelled on to the dress form waiting. Ruth came in at the sound she had listened to since girlhood, that single note which turned people into units and minutes into columns. She set her palm on the table, felt the grain, and looked briefly toward the window where the lane of pecans marched to the gate. Beyond that gate, a clerk in the nearest county seat had copied figures for the 1850 census not so long ago, column after column in tall hand, describing strangers with the calm of a measuring stick. Records build a town and ask no forgiveness. They do not blush. In the pantry off the back hall, the ledger was lifted down. Lambskin cover, corners softened by years of finals that were never final, and pages ruled like farmland. Names appeared as their owners did not, first names only for some, elaborate curlicues for others, all laid flat by ink. Ruth's entries, stern and spare, made a spine down one margin. Sewing, mending, fitting hours. Across from them long columns charted sugar, salt, lamp oil and cloth. The house pretended material was neutral, but the ledger already knew better. It kept a private memory under the public totals, a faint buckling where a rule had been bent to spare a child or to bind one tighter. Ledgers remember pressure. Paper keeps the dent. Eleanor arrived to inspect the day's agenda, her voice made of silk and list. She touched the gown with 2 fingers and asked whether the hem could hold a whisper more grace, which was to say, more certainty at the edge where world met floor. Ruth nodded, and the nod was a handshake with the room. She moved the measuring tape over the skirt, letting it glint and drape, a river obeying stones. The needle she chose was slender and exact, and in its eye the morning gathered like a small, bright lake. Ruth threaded without haste. She did not begin. Delay can be a sentence. Down the yard the bell sounded second hour. Men shifted tasks, women lined chores, children learned how sound can be a leash. In the gin house, belts tightened and loosened with their regular squeak, a mechanical liturgy. A boy kicked dust into a private weather and laughed until the overseer's shadow edited the sky. The plantation's economy broadened to the tree line and narrowed to a single step on the stair. It could be seen from the road and felt in a thimble. That is how micro-empires worked. They live on both maps. Ruth resumed her place at the table, laid the gown's train over her forearm and let the cloth cool her skin. She listened to the house perform its own innocence, the piano practicing a hymn, the pantry door aligning with its latch, the front gate sighing after a delivery. She turned the needle in her fingers the way a reader turns a page, softly, then set it down, 'cause sequence matters, and before stitches there must be witness. She opened the ledger to confirm the day's assignment and added a dot with the blunt end of a pencil where a line had skipped. The dot was nothing. The dot was a seed. When order refuses a mirror, objects will provide one. Afternoon pressed its warm hand on the clapboard walls, and the house returned the courtesy with shuttered patience and measured air. The hallway clock went on, dividing the day into equal intentions, and the piano in the parlour rehearsed the same hymn until its piety turned to wallpaper. Beyond the back gallery, wash steam lifted in pale veils, and drifted toward the pecans like a message no one planned to read. The bell dozed between hours, a hanging moon of brass. Its clapper nicked where time had corrected it. The light in the sewing room arrived slanted and fateful. The room accepted it. Order advanced in small, victorious gestures, because that is how order proves itself when watched. Eleanor adjusted a vase by the fraction of a petal, and praised the discipline of dust. The overseer counted sacks in a voice that pretended it had never met hunger, then signed a slip that pretended to be mercy. In the pantry, the ledger waited with its belt of twine. Pages ruled and numbered. The gown kept its place on the form, turned slightly toward the window as if eager to learn whether roads were telling the truth. The window told polite weather. Threat arrived as it prefers to arrive in such houses, courteous, deniable, and distributed through errands. A merchant's boy brought a folded note that mentioned, in ink careful as manners, the renewal of a promissory obligation. A whisper came from the quarters lane, where the dust keeps a record of feet, and the whisper had a name that would be unfortunate if spoken near the veranda. Someone coughed in the laundry and caught the sound in the crook of her arm, as if returning a borrowed book. The bell did not ring. Threat preferred echoes to alarms. Ruth felt the air lean, the way air does when a storm gathers its grammar 2 counties over. She spread the skirt on the table, allowed the silk to cool her wrist, and placed a needle on the cloth like a quiet punctuation. She listened to the room list its proofs: straight grain in the tabletop, tidy stacks of folded muslin, chalk that did not wander off its lines, and knew that proof can be a costume. She touched the measuring tape the way one greets an old teacher. The tape understood sequence, Ruth understood witness, resolve waited without tapping its foot. The incident, when it came, did not come where the house could narrate it to its own advantage. A cry rose from the direction of the laundry, thin and startled, and ended early, as if convinced mid-sentence by the rules of the grammar that governs pain, when pain is not supposed to exist. A pot clanged with the kind of certainty heavy objects enjoy. The corridor took 2 steps toward concern and then, remembering, stepped back. Someone said, "Hush," and meant, "We will survive this by naming it nothing." The bell stayed still. Stillness can be a vote. In the pantry, the ledger absorbed a new line with the resignation of a field that has seen late frost. Paper can rehearse innocence. The overseer came to the sewing-room door and leaned his knuckles on the jamb, considering the gown with a gaze that claimed interest in fabric while counting other things. He said the weather had gone showy. He said the river would be proud this week. He said nothing about laundry or whispers or the tiredness that had learned how to fold itself into shoulders without showing. Ruth turned the needle between finger and thumb and let silence answer, because silence sometimes keeps sentences from becoming weapons. She laid the hem across her lap, a border waiting to be defined. The border breathed. Eleanor crossed the threshold half an hour later with a smile shaped like obligation. She requested a lighter step in the skirt for the evening's procession, as if air itself were an accessory a woman could borrow. Her perfume parted the day like a soft blade and left the room slightly rearranged. She did not mention the laundry. She asked if the hymn had been practiced to the end. Ruth nodded, and the nod took its place among other nods in the house's archive of compliance. Compliance can be curated. Outside, a cloud dragged a sleeve across the sun and unbuttoned the colours from the yard. The bell gave a small, accidental kiss against its yoke, a sound so private it seemed imaginary. In the distance, a mule protested with the dignity of an older contract, one that remembers barter before signatures. The road went on, pretending to be a path for anyone with feet, and the pecans kept their counsel. The gown waited, not pretending. Ruth lifted the needle once, as if to begin, and then settled it again where the light pooled. She opened the ledger to confirm her assignment, found her name with its sober brackets, and traced, not touching, the margin where entries sometimes buckled when the writer pressed too hard. Paper keeps dents, even after ink dries. Dents are a kind of testimony. What is denied in speech will surface as posture. Late light settled on the veranda like linen folded twice, and the drive gathered up a visiting carriage as neatly as a tray receives cups. Hooves spoke in muffled syllables over the packed earth, and the corridor inhaled the scent of bay rum before the man himself crossed the threshold. He was the physician recommended by the minister's wife, a gentleman whose bag clicked shut with the confidence of solved equations, and whose manners arranged air into the house brightened itself one notch. It wanted to be certified, it always does. He greeted Eleanor with the solemnity of a hymn and pronounced the afternoon excellent for steadiness and small corrections. He admired the big house in a tone reserved for institutions, praised its discipline, and allowed that nerves, when blessed by order, generally obey. In the parlour he felt the piano's keys and encouraged their moderation, then asked for a draught-free chair and a glass with 2 ice chips. Precisely 2. Even his requests were measurements. Numbers steadied him. Numbers steadied those who are served by them. He toured the rooms as if reading a ledger of spaces, tapping a knuckle on door frames, approving the pantry's clean edges, and asking idle questions that placed people on lists. In the sewing room he paused before the dress form, tilted his head and smiled at the gown's repose. He complimented the line of the skirt with the admiration of a man assessing a well-drawn artery. He spoke of posture and the health of bearing. He did not speak of weight that is not to be lifted by those who carry it. Silence performed its usual core. Ruth stepped back from the table as he entered, hands folded in habit, the needle resting on the blue dish like a bright comma. The physician nodded at her without using her name and asked, through Eleanor, whether the heme would travel well between pew and aisle. Ruth replied with the smallest of words, and the smallest word travelled farther than the question intended. He approved. Approval is a stamp a stranger can carry in his pocket and still believe official. In the hall, the guest book waited, its cream pages hopeful and vain. The physician uncapped his pen and signed with a flourish that spilled satisfaction down the margin, the letters making a fence of approval around the date. On the facing page, the overseer, summoned by habit, had already notated deliveries: lamp oil, coarse salt, bluing, needles. Beef in the pantry ledger. A new line appeared under a practised hand. Ruth, sewing, extra hours, evening, the way a river quietly annexes a bank and calls the change natural. Paper pretends to be weather when it is actually law. Law often prefers to be mistaken for. Eleanor asked for a short walk through the garden, and the physician prescribed it with a kind smile that pinned the afternoon to a diagnosis. The household must avoid excitements, he said, and the word excitement sank like a small stone through clear water. He recommended more air, fewer callers, perfect clothes. He praised the household discipline once more and declared that composure is the surest medicine for women of rank. He did not ask whether composure had a cost or a cashier. Composure is expensive, someone else pays. Ruth adjusted the measuring tape across the skirt, drew it level with the baseboard, and noted the way the silk caught a pale reflection of the window, a line like a horizon where steps would become sentences. She lifted the needle, weighed its temper, and returned it to its dish without beginning. Sequence matters. First the house blesses itself in ink, then the cloth learns what it must say. She touched the ledger's closed cover with the back of her knuckles, acknowledging the page where her name had grown another bracket. The book was warm where recent hands had pressed it. Warmth is a kind of evidence. The physician departed buoyed by his own conclusions, the carriage wheels trimming the drive into solvency. Eleanor, steadied by instructions that matched her preferences, stood taller in the doorway and announced that perfection would proceed as planned. In the sewing room, the light thinned to a finer thread and stitched itself along the hem's edge, a faint seam of evening carefully basted to the Ruth breathed once, deliberately, and let the breath place itself between needle and cloth, like a witness who does not raise a voice but refuses to leave. Witness is sometimes the entire remedy. The house wrote itself a certificate. The afternoon cooled by degrees, as if someone had turned the day down with 2 careful fingers, and the sewing room accepted the gentler light like a mercy it had not requested. Ruth slid the gown from the form and laid its weight across the table, letting the silk settle into the wood's old patience, then eased her hand inside the bodice lining where old seams speak in smaller voices. Lining is where memory hides. Cloth remembers differently than books. Her fingertips met a ridge of thread that did not belong to the present design, a narrow hill stitched years before, and beneath it a tiny bloom of initials, ECC, worked in pale silk now yellowed toward parchment. Eleanor Caroline Fairchild, maiden letters folded under married life, a private geology of the house preserved at the sternum. Ruth held the fabric to the window. The letters showed and faded as cloud shadow crossed, resurfacing with each brightness like names on a river rock when the current lowers. She traced the ridge, not touching until her eyes found a second, fainter set nearby, murmured soon, thin as a rumour and almost gone, the sister no one mentioned above a whisper, the portrait on the hall landing. 16 and forever 6. The lining kept what the parlour edited. Ruth turned to the work-basket where a small paper packet had been saved among stray trims. On it, in Eleanor's hand, a note mourning ribbon kept for sentiment. Inside lay a short length of black silk, smooth as a vow, and a pin so fine it made its own discretion. She did not move to use them. She let their intention breathe. Mourning is a ledger with more columns than ink will confess. Some columns are aired. She returned to the bodice and examined the seams for stories, locating the places where the newer stitches paced over older choices, alterations after a gain, after a loss, after a season, when the waist asked to be believed. The garment had served as registry and mirror both. It had absorbed triumph and weathered correction. She thought of the ledger in the pantry listing births as numbers and calendar. Paper claims objectivity. Cloth admits choreography. Both can lie. Both can testify. At the table's edge, the needle waited in its blue dish, angled toward the light as though pointing at something everyone preferred not to read. Ruth lifted it and watched the tiny eye frame a fraction of window and sky, a makeshift lens that placed the pecans in genteel miniature. She set the needle down again and smoothed the lining flat. The initials under her palm arranged the room into a chapel for a moment, solemn without permission. The hallway clock said nothing different, but time shifted its weight anyway. Seems correct memory. From the yard came a snatch of talk about the Arkansas Gazette printing meeting notices, and someone mentioned a cousin who had learned to read dates by scanning broadsheets in the Mercantile when the owner's back was turned. In Pulaski County, the clerk would shape next month's records with tall letters and careful sums, and women in town would measure grief in clothing for 6 weeks, 6 months, or a year, depending on station, doctrine, and what the neighbours watched. The rules were precise. Their mercy was not. Ruth slid the mourning ribbon back into its packet and closed the lid with the same care one uses with a family Bible that has softened at the hinge from being consulted when storms required footnotes. She inspected the hem's basted line, the quiet border where purpose would eventually live, and pictured steps that would translate private history into public posture. The gown had been monogrammed with ownership. It would walk carrying inscription. Ruth imagined the bell summoning the evening, the aisle accepting a procession, and the cloth answering with a reminder that letters and bodies seldom agree about consequence. She ran the measuring tape along the lower edge, letting the numbers pass under her thumb like a river under a bridge. Numbers travelled, so did names. They travelled differently. At last she folded the bodice back into place, the initials hidden again, the past obedient to present fashion, and tied the muslin-covered strings in a square knot that would not slip if the room turned in its sleep. She wrote nothing in any book. She entered the discovery into the air, where the house could not file it, and into the seam, where it could not be erased without unmaking the garment itself. The needle rested, the ledger waited, the bell rehearsed silence between hours as if practicing diplomacy. Some names survive where ink refuses them. Midweek light flattened the road to town until wagons seemed to float, and dust lifted in polite curtains that opened and closed without applause. At the well near the mercantile, women measured flour into pails and sifted talk with the same calm wrists, giving out the names of storms, the way sailors give stars their duties. The Arkansas heat made everything slow enough to be legible, and so the small edits to truth could be seen walking between shade and doorway, tipped in courtesy like hats at passing. The bell at the plantation slept between hours, but the town had its own bell, a courthouse tongue that preferred noon statements, particularly when statements resembled weather. In the Post, the Arkansas Gazette announced a meeting for improvements along the river landing, and a notice sought a stray mule with a white blaze, last seen near the ferry. A hymn list for the Methodist Sunday followed in neat block, titles standing like fence rails across a page. Under such announcements, people feel protected by categories. Protection arrives in columns. Beside the print, a barrel of nails gleamed like dry rain, and on the porch bench a man read aloud the price of salt as if reciting from Proverbs. Lists make stern lullabies. They put the unmeasured to sleep. Down by the quarters, news travelled differently, carried in the pitch of a voice, the pause at a name, the way someone folded a cloth twice instead of 3 times. Carrie's back was stoved, and not improving. Hiram's boy had come through fever but forgot how to like food. A cousin across the river had been placed, farther down state, a verb that hid distance the way a blanket hides a nail. Ruth listened during water breaks and kept the talk arranged in her mind like pins on a card, separate yet pricking when touched. Pins write a different history. It doesn't require ink. Parlour silence performed a counter-sermon. Eleanor entertained the minister's wife with an inventory of charitable intentions and a display of linens rinsed until virtue shone through thread. She spoke of the coming supper's good, and how the town needed models of steadiness, and how the Fairchild household had always held to the highest pattern. Her sentences made a lace that seemed to hold by itself, delicate and firm. They admired the gown's colour and its line across the waist, then turned to the window as if daylight might co-sign the impression. Windows are often drafted into such work. They sign without reading. At the mercantile, a girl no older than memory traced letters in the dust on the porch plank, copying from a broadside until the shopkeeper shooed her with a kindness disguised as scold. Across the way, a blacksmith wiped his arm with a strip of sacking and said nothing about anything because metal had taught him what mouths cannot carry. A deacon passed, touched his hat, and inquired after the minister's cough, as though care were a bridge built from niceties. Bridges made of niceties fall only when no one is looking. That is their genius. Back at the house, the pantry ledger acquired 2 lines with the gentility of drifting snow. Candles, 2 dozen, and beneath it, Ruth's sewing. After supper, paper does not frown when it adds, it only lengthens. Ruth turned a page and saw last year's entry for a similar week, need names and items, weather noted once, then nothing, proof that years can be made to look the same if enough columns are aligned. The sameness is intentional. The sameness is camouflage. In the sewing room, the needle rested in its dish as if it had opinions about patience. Ruth set the gown's hem over her knees and watched the light revise its sheen, a small cloud rowing slow across the silk like a careful boat on a deep pond. She recorded the town's whispers in the order of their courage. Carrie, Hiram's boy, the cousin downstate, the mule, the hymn list, the river landing improvements, the minister's cough, each made a stitch in the afternoon, and together they formed a border the parlour could not fully own. Borders have their own law. It is older than ledgers. Eleanor entered to discuss callers, the way one discusses weather forecasts, and the talk arranged itself into a bouquet of assurances tied with ribbon the colour of command. She wanted the evening to glide, and the glide to glow, and the glow to instruct the less composed in how to be properly persuaded by appearance. Ruth nodded where nods are currency. She smoothed the theme that will one day translate footfall into thought. She let the needle remain bright but idle. Brightness can be a refusal. Dusk confessed itself with a soft surrender at the edges of the yard, and somewhere a whippoorwill began his lesson in repetitive lament. The courthouse bell made its round announcement, untroubled by the specificities it could not house, and the plantation bell answered, two distant cousins agreeing that time had opinions. Ruth closed the ledger with her fingertips and felt the linger of heat where the last entry had settled, a domestic afterglow that paper mistakes for virtue. She breathed through the seam, across the dish of needles, past the window and into the road, where dust holds the day's true minutes. Communal silence can be the loudest judgment. Night took the yard in an even hand and pressed the house into a calmer grammar, the shutters whispering as the wind proofread their hinges. Beyond the pecans the Arkansas sky held its breath, a black ledger pricked with cold stars, and from the river came a rumour of current turning over its long thought. Lamps lowered to embers along the corridor, the piano's last chord evaporated into the rafters, and the hallway clock turned the hour with a sound like a soft reminder not to forget. The sewing room kept a modest candle and a discipline of quiet. The quiet had edges you could feel. On the table the gown waited with ceremony, its train lifted to spare dust, its bodice facing the window as if it admired the dark. The needle in the blue dish made a thin gleam that stitched candle to shadow without touching either, a tiny bridge between what is shown and what is withheld. Ruth stood with her palm on the fabric, letting the silk's cool speak a caution older than fashion, the kind of counsel women keep when rooms are not trusted. Far off, a fox barked once in the pasture, and silence absorbed the remark as a banker absorbs a coin. The house lay under its own oath. The records had done their afternoon work and now slept in their respective boxes. The guest book with two polite signatures for callers who had looked at everything and seen only themselves. The pantry ledger with a fresh line. Ruth, sewing, after supper, drawn as calmly as fence. In the county seat, a clerk's cramped hand had finished copying abstracts for the quarter, Pulaski's numbers submitting to the posture of neatness they prefer in public. Twire lists for Sunday lay stacked on the parsonage table, with the hymns arranged like stair-steps, rock of ages waiting to make its usual stone. Numbers and titles appeared to settle the world. They only settled ink. Ruth breathed and let the room present its inventory. Chalk, pins, shears asleep in their sheath, a tape curled like a river on a map, a spool the colour of old bone, the needle bright as a syllable that wishes to be spoken but refuses to cause harm. She did not move as a machinist would move, or as a dramatist might describe a movement. She moved as a witness writes a line in the air and leaves the pen uncapped beside it, certain the sentence would arrive without being forced. Her hands arranged the cloth toward meaning rather than toward spectacle. Meaning is heavier than spectacle. It weighs correctly. She marked the hem's passage with a seamstress's imagination and a pilgrim's restraint, attending to the edge where fabric will meet floor and therefore community, where steps translate private conviction into public management of space. The act remains symbolic by design, replacing all appetite for mechanics with the courage of intention, and the room felt it the way a field feels the first cool under a coming front. The needle crossed the distance between duty and conscience, the way a bell's tone crosses an acre and does not bruise the air. No bruise was made, a boundary was asked to remember itself. In a gust that touched nothing breakable, the bell in the yard answered the night with a brief, accidental tongue, a single syllable that made the rafters listen to themselves. Ruth paused and let that syllable pass through her like the hush before Amen, and in its after-ring she pictured the aisle bright under Sunday noon, pews holding faces, and a procession that would be a lesson in proportion. She saw no calamity, no spectacle pleasing to gossip. She saw a gait amended by conscience, a glide persuaded into attention, a public posture that finally resembled the truth of its private cost. Truth would be asked to walk. The candle guttered once, recovered, and lifted a steadier leaf of flame. In its steadiness, Ruth returned the needle to its dish the way a curate returns a key to its nail, neither triumphant nor afraid, only clear. She folded the muslin cover over the gown with the same care one uses when closing a family Bible, to keep the page from stealing light. She tied the tapes and pressed them once so the knot would hold the lesson without requiring an audience. Audience is not the point, alteration is. She looked toward the window where the lane dissolved into a darker ribbon, and imagined the road to town lying under its customary sentences. Price of salt, mule notices, schedules for ferries. Ready to receive a new sentence too small for print. She set the chair back by the table so the room would read as it had read at dusk, then stood in the doorway and listened for any breath that did not belong to the house. None arrived. The house kept its oath. She kept hers. Some nights revise law without raising a voice. Sunday arrived wearing the colour of porcelain, the sky rinsed to a pale vow and the heat arranged into respectable layers. The road to town found its manners, and buggies stitched neat threads of dust that refused to become stories until the bell told them so. On the green, boys practised stillness under their mothers' glances, and men praise weather as if they had invented moderation. The church doors stood open, cool as convictions. The bell drew its circle in the air, and the town stepped into it. Circles make citizens. Inside, pews creaked like old promises taking their places. Fans moved a patient theology from hand to hand, and hymn books waited open to Rock of Ages, as if rock could be paper when the hour required paper to be rock. The minister's cough made its rehearsal at the chancel rail, polite and brief, and the deacon arranged the offering plates so their gleam suggested order with a hint of mercy. In the side room the vestry ledger lay flat and blank, its rule lines prepared to domesticate generosity, its dates square, ready to receive another obedient Sunday. Ledgers choreograph virtue, they do not generate it. Eleanor Fairchild arrived at the aisle's head with her household trailing the proper number of steps, the gown carrying noon across its skin like a practised sentence that knows how to be read aloud. The hem took the floor with authority, and then, at the first measured glide, it refused to forget. Each step asked for attention, not rapture. Each yard of silk negotiated with the wood in favour of caution, not conquest. The room felt the decision before any mind explained it, the way a congregation feels an unscheduled silence and accepts it as instruction. No one stumbled, something steadied. The choir found the key and held it, and yet beneath their unity a new rhythm insisted on being counted, a second arithmetic braided through the first, placing commas where earlier the town had preferred dashes. Ruth stood at the rear with the other domestics, eyes lowered per the script that denied seeing to those who see most, and she let the bell's fading tone measure the distance between spectacle and truth. The distance was 1 hem's width wide. It was enough. Faces performed the craft of noticing without confession. The minister's wife adjusted her fan in a way that changed its meaning from temperature to thought. The merchant's daughter blinked twice, and then not again. The courthouse clerk wrote nothing because writing would have been too honest, and the overseer's gaze practised vacancy and failed by a hair. Eleanor kept dignity's angle, but the gown taught another lesson, one about how a body moves when its story has been edited by those who cannot read the cost. The lesson was gentle, it was also irrevocable. At the offertory the plates travelled with their customary gravity, coins and folded bills declaring allegiance to causes that sound like virtues, and sometimes are. Behind the pulpit the deacon entered the totals into the vestry book, with a hand trained to mistake sums for peace, and on the margin he wrote the hymn numbers in a pride that looked like tidiness. On that page a small buckle appeared where the nib pressed too hard, a bruise of paper that would remain under the ink long after the day forgot its precise weather. Records wound their clocks, experience set them back 1 minute. After the benediction, talk released itself like doves that remember cages. The moderator's wife declared the line of the dress instructive, a word that travelled lawfully down the steps and out to the green, where it nested in 2 conversations and then 4. On the porch, the minister submitted that restraint is a Christian ornament, and the merchant agreed because agreement is a currency that stabilizes shelves. In the side yard, a child imitated Eleanor's shortened glide and laughed, and his mother corrected the laugh with a glance that made the boy a future adult. Futures form quickly, they take their cues. Eleanor withdrew to the vestry for water, posture intact, anger powdered into composure so fine it looked like light. She blamed humidity to the deacon, then blamed the floorboards to the sexton, then blamed nothing at all to the small mirror that tells the truth only when begged. The sexton traced a knuckle along a plank seam and said the summer had swelled things no carpenter could control. He was not speaking only of wood. Ruth, passing with a folded cloth, paused the length of a breath and heard the bell answer some unseen wind with a single thought that could not be entered in any book. The thought was proportion. When the plates were locked and the hymn books stacked, the vestry ledger received its closing line, date, sum, signatures, and a space where commentary might have been if commentary were allowed to be honest and ink. Outside, wheels gathered their dust and the green returned to ordinary. The aisle, however, kept a memory in the faint, rearranged polish of its boards, a new sheen where a lesson had passed. Aisles keep minutes the way rivers keep maps. They do not forget. Public posture can correct private power without a shout. By Monday the air had mislaid its Sunday polish, and the yard resumed its ordinary verbs, the pump heaving, hens commuting, a rake persuading gravel into short-lived order. Heat rose in transparent squares from the wagon path, and the Arkansas sky put its blue back on like a work shirt. From the gin house came the steady catacombs of belts and pulleys, and beyond the pecans the river rolled its courthouse vowels, indifferent as ever to wardrobes and sermons. The house tried to regain its narrative. The house failed by degrees. Eleanor announced with serenity sharpened to a point that the autumn musicale would be postponed for causes not worth the naming, and the sentence travelled the rooms with the efficiency of a well-placed pin. Chairs returned to their everyday angles, the piano closed its lid as if in modesty, and flowers from yesterday's arrangement discovered the limits of water. A politeness curdled, it did not spill. In the pantry, a line in the ledger recorded candles returned, as though light itself had been over-ordered and now corrected. Below it a hand wrote Ruth, mending domestic, the promotion to invisibility that usually calls itself prudence. Paper altered tone without confessing motive. Paper is fluent in euphemism. Small insubordinations appeared where no person could be blamed. The wardrobe in the sewing room refused to keep its right-hand door asleep, swinging back an inch after every closure, as if the hinges had remembered another version of truth. The clock in the hall lost a minute by noon, and 2 by tea. In the garden the boxwood hedge browned along a single ruler straight seam, a withering so tidy it resembled a signet. The front steps, rinsed each morning, took on a grainier thirst, as if they had decided to drink more than they were offered. Landscape keeps a record. It prefers allegory. Ruth was moved from the shining labour to the repairs that households considered non-musical: patches for aprons, a sleeve that needed rethinking, a child's collar button hunted on hands and knees until found under the same chair every lost thing chooses. The needle, loyal to whatever task is given, learned the new cadence without complaint, dipping through coarse cloth with a sound more workmanlike than liturgical. At midday she carried mending to the back gallery and felt the shade hold her like a parent who will not speak ill of the other parent. Silence can be kind and still accurate. Visitors came in fewer numbers and they left sooner, their compliments wearing the careful smell of items recently returned to the shelf. A neighbour delivered pears and a story about a cousin's rheumatism that somehow worried the ear more than it should. The minister called to solicit linens for the poor and did not stay to sit. On the porch, the guest book acquired thin pages of days with no names. Gaps had their own handwriting. In the pantry, the ledger kept its courage, inks regularly columns, totals obedient, and yet the lower right corner of one page developed a faint, persistent curl, a tide mark of domestic climate. Dampness or doctrine, the curl made no distinction. Books are bodies when they are honest. In the quarters, children rehearsed a shorter glide for play and then forgot it because children's bodies preferred truth, even when asked to imitate poise. Carrie's back eased some, and Hiram's boy ate biscuits again, testimony the parlour could not catalogue. Evenings, the overseer's step softened a little before it found its usual hardness, and once he paused by the bell frame as if to consider tightening the clasp that steadied the tongue, then walked on. He did not tighten it. The bell does not ring unless rung, but it still remembers ringing. Toward week's end, a weather shift teased the horizon, high clouds feathering the blue like ratios that decide not to complete their work. Ruth set a tray of mended items on the table and returned the needle to its blue dish with the care due to instruments that do not know they are instruments of history. She opened the wardrobe, closed it, watched it open itself a fraction, and smiled at the room's small refusal to consent to an old story. She touched the pantry ledger on her way past, and felt the place where yesterday's ink had thickened over a word that did not wish to be written. The thickening was a kind of bruise, house's bruise. At dusk, the lane to the gate darkened into an honest ribbon, and the pecans shook down 1 or 2 leaves as if to test gravity's patience. The piano, unlidded for practice, remained mute. The bench, set square, waited without expectation. In the quiet, a moth tapped the window once, twice, and then located night. Ruth breathed and found the room's centre by listening for what could not be heard. The hem's lesson still working itself into the floorboards, a revision to the house's gate. The revision held. After certain Sundays, nothing collapses. Everything leans. Ideas do their work the way menders do, quiet and patient, and the house learned to wear its alterations without discussion. Travellers on the river still read the Arkansas banks for weather. Circuit riders still measured their sermons to the heat, and the county seat still trained its books to look like certainty. Yet in town a saying took root and travelled by apron string and porch rail until it lived in the air the way a melody lives. It meant dress neat. It meant walk true. It meant let your conscience touch the ground before your pride does. People said it with a smile for girls at their first dances, and with a different smile for women entering rooms that prefer mirrors to windows. Proverbs are quilts. They piece truth from scraps. Artifacts surfaced the way low water reveals stones. In the church storeroom, the sexton found a cracked clapper wrapped in linen and tagged in a careful hand. Bell injured mid-50-ish. He kept it on a shelf beside broken hymn-boards and a length of brass chain, whose purpose the living had forgotten. Children who were allowed to dust the room were told the clapper had taught restraint to the bell, and they learned, delighted, that even metal can be a student. In an attic of the big house, a trunk yielded a faded silk fragment with a basted seam that led nowhere the eye could follow. Someone folded it back into its nest as if tucking in an elderly witness. In the quarters, a great-aunt kept a thimble in a tea-tin and tapped its rim when stories needed emphasis, saying merely, "Measure," and the tin's dry ring made everyone listen. The ledger in the pantry outlived its owners and changed administrations, its corners rounded by decades of totals. When a later generation brought it to town for safekeeping, the county clerk opened it as one opens a weathered gate and found, among rations and cloth, the old spine of Ruth's name descending a page like a narrow stair. He traced not touching the faint buckles where some hand had pressed too hard, and then pretended not to. He closed the book with the mild respect given to relics that refuse sainthood. Paper, when it has survived long enough, begins to confess. It can't help it. The aisle boards in the church kept their polish altered by a single season, and older parishioners could point with a shoe-tip to the section that seemed to ask for attention, as if the floor expected weight to think before it landed. They did not say why, they only paused. A pause can remain a doctrine after the sermon is lost. On summer afternoons the porch would gather its regulars, Smith with his county notices, Rachel with pies for the auction, a clerk who knew how to lean, and somebody would mention the year when dignity slowed down and trouble did not follow. The phrase travelled with dignity. It did not break anything. When the 1860 count approached, men with enumerators' books knocked at doors and put dowdy numbers into their ledgers, and the town held still for columns because columns were a habit and habits a furniture. In private, mothers adjusted daughters' skirts with a pinch that meant remember the edge. In public, Eleanor's descendants carried posture like a surname, beautiful and cautious. Now and then a descendant of the quarters would sew a hidden line into a quilt border, a faint ladder that meant boundary, and when hands smoothed the finished square, the stitch sang the least loud hymn a house can sing, and still be a house. Quilts keep minutes other clocks cannot hold. Ruth's path did not win a line in the county history, but her name continued in whispers that behaved themselves, faithful to the rules of people who learned early how to speak without witnesses. In kitchens, women teaching girls to thread needles would say, "Hold your breath one small moment before you begin," and the pause was not for accuracy, it was for truth. In autumn, when the bell's new clapper rang truer than the old, there lingered in its tone a kind remembrance of the time silence had won a vote. Bells remember in metals, we remember in customs. Some afternoons the river dropped low enough to show a gravel shoal that looked like a line drawn by a careful hand. Boys played there and named it court, because a court is any place where a rule is briefly visible. They brought home pocketfuls of smooth stones and left them on windowsills to watch light choose. Years later, one of those boys signed his name beneath a petition to rebuild the ferry landing with safer footing, and when asked why he cared for such unseen edges, he shrugged and said, "A town walks on what it believes about borders." He did not mention hems. He did not need to. The house that once believed display could carry virtue unassisted, learn proportion the way most houses learn anything, by repetition. Doors no longer swung entirely closed for their own satisfaction. They waited a heartbeat for company. The wardrobe kept its small corner inches as if to remind the room that consent is better when checked twice. The guest book thinned into blankness and then into a different fashion, yet the habit remained of signing with less flourish and more steadiness. Flourish ages poorly, steadiness travels. So the legend settled without fireworks, a scene that advised attention, a bell that remembered caution, a town that learned to hear pauses as sentences. No court wrote the verdict, the aisle did. No sermon declared the doctrine, the hem taught it. When law mistook display for righteousness, a hidden stitch restored scale, and that was the whole arithmetic, not spectacle, not ruin, a correction you could feel with your foot and carry in your hand. A quiet craft can rebuke power and keep its dignity.